I remember my husband and I laying in the grass and falling asleep and waking up and saying, oh my God, we weren't robbed. We weren't attacked. What a life is this? I remember early days going to restaurants, and my husband didn't have to make sure his back was to the door and his head wasn't on a swivel. And I remember walking down the streets, and people might stare at us because we were a little different, but it wasn't because we were Black in America. I never got stopped by police just for being out like I often did at home. So the stress alone of not being Black in America took a weight off of me that allowed me then to focus on my health physically.
Welcome to Flourish in the Foreign, the award-winning podcast that celebrates, elevates, and affirms the voices and stories of Black women living and thriving abroad, while exploring living abroad as a pathway to wellness. I'm your host, Christine Job, a Black American with Trinidadian roots, business strategist and writer from Atlanta, based in Valencia, Spain. Hey everyone, welcome back to Flourish in the Foreign. I am your favorite podcast host, Christine Job. Okay, I'm one of your favorite podcast hosts, probably, Christine Job. If you are new, hi, welcome to your new favorite podcast, or one of them, hopefully. I'm so glad that you decided to check out this episode. Before we get into today's episode, make sure you are subscribed to my Substack. Come on, subscribe to my Substack. Thank you. My Substack, Flourish in the Foreign Truths and Musings, is where I share my personal reflections on life abroad, my author journey, and full conversations with some of my Season 6 guests. So if you ever wanted to see the raw, unedited versions of some of these interviews, this is your opportunity. It is. So subscribe to my Substack, Flourish in the Foreign Truths and Musings. And finally, I am already planning Season 7, and I'd love to feature more incredible Black women who lived abroad for at least 5 years. So this is your opportunity. If you're like, I love Flourish in the Foreign, however, I want to hear stories from this particular type of Black woman, or I want to hear stories about this particular city or place, this is your opportunity for you to help me help you. Okay, I can't do it all. I'm constantly producing, and although I'm in talks, and I have been in talks for several years with Black women living all around the world on all continents, minus Antarctica, what makes it to seasons is really people who are responsive and also committed and available to recording when I'm in production, okay? That's how it goes. So help me help you, all right? If you want to hear something in particular, or if you know someone, or if it's you, okay? Nominate them. Encourage them to apply at flourishintheforeign.com/contact so that I can continue to share these incredible stories for us, by us, okay? All right. Let's get into today's episode. Season 6, Episode 16. Today's guest is LaTanya Hilton. Ava recently retired as the Chief Executive Officer of a financial services software development firm. She is also a founding partner of Hilton Advisors, LLC and Playa Publishers, LLC. And throughout her career, she held global tech and change management leadership positions at IBM, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Booz Allen Hamilton. Ava also was the executive director of Cultural DC, and her time there included the creation of the first ever mobile art gallery, which took visual and performing arts to communities across the DC, Maryland, and Virginia areas. I have been wanting to chat and record with Ava ever since I learned about Ava. We were introduced through our mutual friend, Erin. So shout out to Erin for that. And let me tell you, this conversation did not disappoint. It absolutely lived up to all of the rumblings that I had heard through our mutual friend. I really enjoy chatting with Ava anytime I get to see her, but recording this conversation was just such a highlight for this season. And I know you all are going to absolutely enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ava tell you all about it.
My name is Ava, middle name LaTanya, last name Hilton. My age is 70, where we live in Valencia, Spain. I was actually born and raised in a place called Detroit, Michigan, during the time when a record label called Motown was at its height in the 60s and 70s. One thing that came to mind when you asked me where I was from was the fact that when I was born, my birth certificate said that I was colored. Then I remember at some point I was Negro, and then later I was Black, and then I became African American. In terms of the labels assigned to me in the U.S., where I was born and raised, I wonder what, if any, other labels will be assigned to me as long as I'm on God's good earth. But it was just an interesting thought that came to mind. I grew up in an inner city environment as a poor kid, and I had the opportunity afforded to me to quote unquote get out of the ghetto, as we would say back when I was young in the 60s and 70s. I also had the honor of having a second father in our lives, and our lives comprised of my mom and my two sisters when we left my father, who my biological father was very young when he and my mother conceived me. I'm the oldest. And as a result, it was a difficult time for them. My dad became a pretty violent alcoholic. And so I believe I was 8. I had a sister that was 4 and one that was just 6 months old when we left my dad one day with nothing but the clothes on our backs. The good news is, as a result, I'm still here. The bad news is we were homeless for a bit. It took a lot for my mother to have the courage to finally leave with nothing. And here I am today in Valencia, Spain, on La Playa, watching the waves roll in as we go through yet another gentle storm here. When I think of how I began, that's pretty much how I began. Surprisingly, in our little inner city high school, which was kind of big actually, we were the first and probably only class to graduate in 1972 with having taken a trip abroad called the senior class trip. That's what we called it. And for 4 years, we raised money to go to Spain and Africa. Many of us had never been on an airplane, let alone out of the country. It was a pretty harrowing experience raising the money for that trip. But ultimately, after people were murdered in our fundraising dances and venues in our city, etc., including a dear friend of mine who was in the band at the time, and he was shot by gangs that infiltrated our fundraiser. We ended up, about 18 of us, in Malaga, Spain one day, traveled around Spain, and then went to Tunisia and Tangiers and other places. What an incredible experience. But one thing stands out about that experience to me beyond the violence that it took to get us there, and that is that I was on the beach. I'd never been on a beach, and I saw families, like kids and parents together, laying on the beach. And I said, oh my God, one day, please, I hope I have a family. We can be on the beach in Spain. I fast forward right quick to 2018, a year after Steve and I bought a place in Valencia, Spain, to use largely for vacations and as a tourist rental. We had our two children, Justin and Taylor, who were young adults at the time, still are with us, thank God. There for Christmas 2018. We were all four walking on the beach on Christmas Day. And all of a sudden, their mom, who's always a drama queen at some level, just started sobbing out of nowhere. And the kids were like, Mom, you okay? Did you hurt yourself? What's going on? Lo and behold, it hit me that I had a family on the beach in Spain decades later. Quite honestly, it never hit me when we first came to Valencia, when we bought the property in 2017. I never even thought of this thing that I dreamed when I was 17, now that I was well into my 60s. And here we are, there we were. And it just hit me hard like a ton of bricks that this actually happened in my life and is still happening today.
Ava's first experiences abroad in Spain and Tunisia happened in the 70s. So I was really interested in her sharing more about that experience.
We were there for maybe 8 to 10 days, and we were all kids who'd never really traveled and been on vacations. We were all kids that grew up mostly in single head of household homes with very violent surroundings. And just to be able to go out and explore in the evenings without fear of violence was a new thing for us. And to be able to be embraced by people who we didn't even speak their language, but they just surrounded us, not only warmth and generosity, but with experiences that we'd never had. I remember I had never drank. Given my dad's history, I was probably not one that was going to be drinking in my teens based on my experience with that. But I remember they had these sacks that you turned up to drink wine from. And so we all tried it because we'd never seen wine in a sack, an animal type skin. And back then in Spain, that was pretty popular. And so there was all these rich experiences. That's just one tiny one. But the people just really embraced us, and we really felt free to just explore, experience new things, jump in waterfalls. We'd never even seen a waterfall. We didn't even know what it was called when we first arrived. The explosion of new experiences is what I remember the most. And I decided in my mind, probably subconsciously at the time, that my limits should not be imposed by the environment that I existed in at that moment, because there was so much more to be explored. And that experience opened my mind to exploration. I was already one of these kind of curious, crazy kids who would do all kinds of things. But that really opened a door that has never closed since.
I asked Ava if she attended university, and if so, which university she attended, what did she study, and if she had the opportunity or interest to study abroad.
I had the opportunity to have a grandmother, which was my father's mother, who opened a school of dance when I was 4 years old. She was white. She remarried after divorcing my grandfather when I was 3, a French guy who we called Grandpa LaBelle, who was an acrobat. They opened a school of dance in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. At that time, I couldn't visit them because I was Black and Blacks weren't allowed in that neighborhood. But my dad would take me in the evening when no one knew, rush me in, and I learned to dance, starting with ballet with my grandma. And I also learned acrobatics with my granddad. So uneven bars, parallel, trapeze, all of that. And why is this relevant? Because when I think of college, I think of the fact that my mother made the mistake many years later of allowing me to audition for Juilliard, which is a prestigious school of performing arts. Because I was such an athletic dancer, they hadn't really seen that back in those days, think 1971, right? And I was a pretty good choreographer as well. Long story made a little bit longer. My mom said, no, you can't go. And it crushed me, as you could imagine, since dance has always been and was then my first love. It was like my escape, my savior, the true me coming out in a way that was safe at the time. She did not have the money for room and board, and the scholarship only covered tuition and books. So fast forward again, I got creative and turned down all the schools I got accepted to, Brown, UCLA, Michigan, other schools, by writing as my mom, because back then your parents controlled everything, and saying, sorry, she's not coming. Thank you very much. So I assumed and didn't tell her that 2 weeks before school was to start, she'd have to let me go and we'd figure out the living thing. And I was young. I had just turned 17 when I went to college. And my mother was so upset with me. I don't think she spoke to me for a while. But she and the principal of my high school got together and somehow got me a 4-year fellowship at a place called the University of Minnesota with a work-study program to offset whatever other costs. I was devastated. The reason they were able to pull this off so quickly is because I had been a take the bright, poor kid out of the ghetto and put them with a wealthy family in the suburbs of Edina, Minnesota kid from an upward bound government program. And as a result of living with this family, I had attended some classes at the University of Minnesota. So they were able to integrate me in without the usual process because I had already been, quote unquote, a student there. So 4 years later, I graduate from the University of Minnesota with what my mother wanted, which was a Bachelor of Science in Business, all kinds of student awards and things. But I also got this little Bachelor of Science in Education, focusing on dance education. So I was able to dance and I was able to appease my mom and get a real degree. And I continued my dance throughout my illustrious life until I was 42, dancing professionally as well as amateur in the U.S. and abroad. I completed my education with 2 other things that occurred in my life. One, I worked for a computer company called IBM, which was like Apple or Google would be today back then. We were the shit, so to speak, you know. And they sent me and a few others to a special program called the IBM's President's Class at that time in 1980, I believe it was. And it was tantamount to an executive MBA at Harvard University. So this really exposed me to education on a whole nother level than what I had been privy to before, and racism on a whole nother level than I had experienced, even though the first time I was called a nigger to my face was at the University of Minnesota about a week after I'd been there. And there were only, I think at the time there were 40,000 students in 1972. And of those 40,000, there were less than 1,000 that were people of color and less than 100 that were Black Americans. So you can imagine what that life experience was like those 4 years, but it was really educational for me in so many ways. So I went to Harvard. It was a great time in my life for it to happen because I had been excelling at IBM. However, I was in a relationship that I started as a freshman in college, and now I'm almost 23, 24. And it was with someone who was in the public eye, very successful and became very wealthy over time. And we were in New York, and Manhattan is an intense place with a lot of public exposure. And this is before internet and email and social media. So I can't imagine what celebrities go through today. But having said that, when I got to Harvard, I was pretty exhausted. And a professor there kind of adopted me and discovered something in me that I didn't know I had in myself and recommended me for 2 programs overseas. And it was kind of the escape I was looking for that I didn't even know. It was a chance to rejuvenate and find myself again because I had lost myself. So having said that, I went off to Oxford, got accepted, loved the guys in their robes, didn't like how really isolated it felt. And I wasn't so sure what a master's in management philosophy would be. I decided to try out the other school that was presented as part of this opportunity from the professor at Harvard. And it was called the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology at the time in Manchester, England. It's now just called University of Manchester. I went there. It was an industrial town, but the university's program was a master's in management sciences. And I was able to focus on something called change management. At the time, we called it change agents, which change management as a discipline and organizational transformation didn't even exist yet. So I was really excited because technology at the base of it was really about getting people to change and adapt and integrate tools into their everyday work life. So I chose Manchester. Now, should I have chosen Oxford? So I have Harvard and Oxford on my resume? Yes. But looking back now at 70, it all worked out. But moving to England changed my life forever. I ended up not going to McKinsey and Company after I went there for the master's, but going back to IBM because they offered me as a mid-20s kid an opportunity to work for a person who ran part of the European business. So I got to live in England, in France, in South Africa during apartheid in Johannesburg, where I had a visa as an honorary white in order to go to restaurants, meetings, hotels. And then they thought I was a colored, so I almost got arrested multiple times because I wasn't blackety black in terms of the pigment of my skin. So I was illegal. As some of us know, there's a comedian who wrote a book talking about how they were illegal. That was me in my 20s. And then I also lived in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia for a bit and had a visa as an honorary male. So many years later, fast forward through my career, I remember having fun giving talks sometimes where I would introduce myself as a white male. And I'd say, you probably don't see me that way when you look at me, but I can prove I've had a visa as a white and a visa as a male. So I think that qualifies me. So it's not so funny, but back then it worked a little bit.
As you have heard, Ava has been around the world and she has lived and worked around the world. And so I asked her if she could walk through each of the places that she's lived abroad and just share some of her general sentiments and reflections on what that time period meant for her personally and professionally.
One of the first memories that came when you asked me to share about my life experience overseas in my 20s is that my mother begged me, sobbing, not to go. And I went anyway. She was worried about my safety. She was worried about being alone in foreign land. I said, well, they speak the same language. And I remember a week after I got to England, the IRA bombed Harrods, the huge department store in London. And my mother was like totally beside herself, calling on telephones. Remember, no email, no iPhones, trying to make sure I was okay. And then I told her, I'm in Manchester, which is a long way from London. I'm fine. And she still begged me to come home again then. I didn't. I stayed. And I remember the first day in class when I was at the University of Manchester, a student said to me, got a rubber I can use loaf? And I was like, what? What? And then I discerned that he wanted a rubber. And I was like, well, I don't typically carry those with me. And he looked at me like, okay, and asked the next person. Well, it was a pencil eraser, right? So that was some of the fun that I learned. And similar to today in Spain, I remember asking for chicken, except I asked for a man's penis because pollo and polla are so close. One is for chicken, the other one is. So I can reflect backwards and forwards in terms of living in different cultures. The thing I remember most about England is not just the language experience, but I walked around in my 20s as a Black American woman and had a roommate who was a white male from England that worked for Kodak. In 1982, 81, who does that? And I remember when his Welsh girlfriend showed up at our apartment, she was like, "This is your roommate?" And he and I had never even thought about it. There was a male and female living together in England. So I have been so non-traditional for so much of my life that some things never really occurred to me until after they happened, reflecting back. And the other thing in England is I drove around in a little convertible MGB Roadster. I had never driven on the other side of the road, and I never driven a stick until I got that car. I almost killed everybody in London the first month or two. And then in terms of my work, they threw me right in. I had the Lloyds of London, I had Barclays Bank, and here I was trying to convince these power brokers as a little Black girl from the US to use this new device that we had. And it used these little floppy disks that you put into this little box. And they were like, "Oh, hell no, we're not putting any of our financials, that's our life, into that box. It's on the big computer in the back room where it belongs." So I was in England when we did the pre-announce of something called a personal computer a year before it was introduced in Boca Raton, Florida, trying to convince clients to test it and use it. That was so exciting. And I took it all for granted. Oh, I got to work with these guys. I got to convince them. They'll do it. What a trailblazer I was and didn't even know it at the time. And I proceeded all over the world doing something similar to try to get people to change and adopt new technology. As I managed the culture in England, I was lucky that I had a white male roommate from London who brought me to his pubs. And what I learned is once somebody brings you as part of their family and their crew, everybody else will embrace you because it's an extended family experience. So I ended up in co-ed rugby, which was really just sloshing around in the mud with lots of drink in you and things like that. I ended up learning to fly gliders in the Lake District. I ended up teaching dance and keep fit. I ended up modeling for a couple of who would become famous designers later. These were all my little side gigs and fun. I ended up skiing in, not only in the Alps, but we like to go to Saalbach Hinterglemm in Austria because it was cheaper, but it still had really good blacks and blue diamonds. So I learned so much, experienced so much more than I had ever experienced in the US, just the first couple of years in England. Then when I went to France, oh my God, you talk about a different language and people teasing me the whole time when I tried to learn French, and I backed off. And today I regret that I didn't just stay tenacious and learn French. But I had a beautiful time in France. And even though I live mostly in Paris, I spent some time in the south of France as well. We had a headquarters office near there. And Saint-Paul-de-Vence, which is a little village above Nice, became one of my favorite hangouts. I'd later take my now 40 years in the making husband there when we first met. Long story short about France, my most memorable experience was getting invited to a Vogue house. And Madonna came up with this song called Vogue, Vogue, some of you may know. But it's about a dance that in the 80s when I was there was underground. And that type of dance was just incredible to me because I'd never been exposed to it. I'd done ballet, jazz, tap, modern with people like Twyla Tharp and Dance Theater of Harlem, and you name it, but I'd never been exposed to voguing. And when some people I met at a bar in Paris invited me back to their house, which is where all of these dancers lived and supported and took care of each other, and then I got invited to their competitions, I was blown away. Just blown away by the resilience, the exuberance, the technical capabilities, the talent, the love of family that they brought together as families. Oh my God, what an incredible experience. Forget the business stuff. That was the most incredible experience there. I did a couple runway shows there for some small boutiques modeling as well. More money on the side to do more travel. Then I went to South Africa. Oh my God. I had no idea. I got my little visa, got on the plane, got off. Oh, by the way, I was traveling a lot during those years. And I realized after a while, took me a while, that they thought I was quote unquote a stewardess. We call them flight attendants now, but back then a stewardess, because people would ask me directions in the airport and they get upset with me when I couldn't answer their questions. Well, what else could I be? I was Black, American, in a blue suit. So, with heels on. So that was funny. I reflect back on that many years after the fact. I went, oh, they probably thought I was a stewardess. In South Africa, the experience that hits me the most, there are two of them. One was my first meeting there, and I walked into a room with all male that were white, as typical for me throughout my career with IBM. And they were speechless once they realized I wasn't there to serve coffee or give them their handouts for the meeting. And I took a seat at the table. When I took a seat at the table, 3 of the 5 men there stood up and they were about to walk out. Those 3 were South Africans. And it took a bit, but once we got the meeting underway, they were so flabbergasted at the fact that there was a person from IBM who was Black, who was American, and who was a woman. That was like a triple whammy. They really couldn't handle it. I don't think they heard a word I said that whole meeting. But eventually, after being there for a while, I was able to break through, become an asset, and convince them to make the changes they needed in their systems environment. The second experience was the first time I went to Soweto. And I can't pronounce anything correctly, so if I'm butchering it, please forgive me. But I thought that when we were homeless and a fireman that was a friend of my mom let us stay in the bottom of the firehouse initially with a blanket over us that the rats ran over while I carried the baby on my chest with the blanket was poverty. But when I went there was no such thing as running water. There was no electricity. They had put their dwellings together with whatever they could find. I don't know if it was metal or wood or grass or whatever. They were living. They were thriving in their own culture amidst all of this incredible poverty. And I learned so much from them because they just embraced me, even though I would still be considered a colored to most of them who they didn't like, I'll admit. But I'll tell you, growing up as a light-skinned, tall, long-haired, silky-haired girl in the U.S., I was ostracized by my own darker Black counterparts as well. So that wasn't new for me. But eventually, the curiosity of me being American and being there while Nelson Mandela was in Robben Island was enough for them to embrace me, learn about me, and there were enough of them that spoke English that I was able to bond with them. They taught me more about resilience than I've ever learned in any other experience in my life. That gets us to Riyadh. Oh my goodness. I think I almost got in 5 accidents being all wrapped up trying to drive a rental car. And because, again, the color of my skin is somewhat caramel, I would get stopped by police all the time because it was illegal for women to drive. As a matter of fact, they just made it legal in 2017. I was there in 1984, I think it was. So just the fact that I was in a car at the wheel got me stopped often. And I'd have to show my visa as an honorary male and my passport and explain where I was going. And I had it written up in their dialect and their language so that they could read it if they didn't speak English. So here I am, traipsing around Riyadh. What am I crazy? Looking back on it, going to meetings, telling people what they needed to do, getting back to my hotel or little apartment dwelling. It was an interesting existence. I felt a little isolated there relative to my other experiences, but I managed to get a couple of colleagues that kind of adopted me and took me to some restaurants and took me to some places. Because I was a foreigner, they would let me in. Otherwise, as a woman, I never would have been accepted in. And as I have friends now in Doha, Riyadh, other places, some of them as young as 28, I realized that many of the norms of the culture still exist. And I realized from that experience the freedoms that I have that I take for granted.
Hey everyone, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Flourish in the Foreign. And if you are, please consider supporting this labor of love, but labor nonetheless, by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/flourishforeign. Make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast and please review the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to the show. Fun fact, if you listen on Spotify, you can leave me comments that I can actually respond to. Yeah. Make sure you follow the podcast on Threads, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and all the other social media platforms that the podcast has. If you want to read more of my personal truths and musings as I explore and navigate the intersection of migration, Blackness, womanhood, and wellness, be sure to subscribe to my Substack, Flourish in the Foreign, Truths and Musings by Christine Job. And for all other Flourish in the Foreign resources about moving, living, and thriving abroad, including guides, courses, and more, be sure to go to flourishintheforeign.com. All right. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Flourish in the Foreign. Now, back to the episode. Dance has been an absolute essential part of Eva's life. And so I asked her to share with us her dance journey.
So I danced from the age of 4 to 42. That's a lot of dance. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a writer's work group, and our prompt was symbolism. So we get a prompt, we take an hour, we write, and then we share what we wrote with the group. And I wrote a piece where I likened the growth of a tree from a seedling to a full-grown tree that matures and weathers with age. I used that as my symbol to talk about my experience in dance. It was interesting. And I got it done in an hour, just that whole thing. So take age 4 to 42, make yourself a seed growing into a tree, and you can tell your story in an hour. The first thing that comes to mind at age 70 is that when I was in physical therapy yesterday, it was one of the first times in a long time that I felt I had a breakthrough session. I was standing up on an elevated podium and I was able to lift one leg up with my knee and then stretch it forward and point my toe and flex my toe and then carry my leg all the way to the side and bring it back down, all controlled with something we call a core today. We called it a center back when I grew up and was dancing. You have to have a good, strong center. You have to have a good, strong core. Well, my core now is non-existent, but I found something in there that kept that leg in the air. And the reason I was in physical therapy is because I've had 2 knee replacements, the most recent one last year. And as a dancer, experienced so many injuries throughout so many years. I think that the person that goes to see a concert or dance performance on the sidewalk in their neighborhood doesn't realize that dancers are some of the ultimate athletes in our world. And we sacrifice so much for the art of movement to express ourselves through movement that is just unimaginable how many of us survive and how those that have highly regarded careers. I didn't have that. I kind of danced on the side and did some contributions and things like that. And that's probably my one regret. One of my grandmothers, which was the other grandmother, my mother's mother, who was from Alabama. The dance grandma, the white one, was from Louisiana. So I really have Southern in my roots as well. But my other grandmother said, make sure you only have 3 regrets in life. I've used 2, so I only have 1 left. I'm holding on to that one. But my true first regret was not pursuing dance against all odds. I really didn't have the strength of character. My sisters later told me, just as recently as it was last year at my 70th birthday celebration in Paris with them, that you had the strength of character, but you gave it all up for us. I get emotional. To go to the university and be first generation to graduate from college, to get a prestigious position from our community's perspective at a company like IBM at 20 years old and being Black American in 1976 was an incredible sacrifice, but I was able to send money home to my family all the time. I was able to pay student loans for my sisters. I was able to get medical care for my mom. The list goes on. And I never thought of it as a sacrifice. They brought that to light just last year. So we all do things for others throughout our lives, and it comes back to us a millionfold. I have been so blessed. I have no real regrets. If I have to have 3 pseudo regrets, that's my first one. Although I felt like I was more talented than Debbie Allen, better than Jane Fonda at Keep Fit, and many others, my idol was Judith Jamison from Alvin Ailey because she was tall, statuesque like me. She was a powerful dancer, and she was so elegant, and she took care and raised so many of us in the art of dance. But beyond that, she raised us to be incredible human beings in the way that she influenced our everyday lives. So when I think of dance, I think of the 4-year-old who, was trying to figure out what the word plie meant. And then I think of the teenager who did my first choreography to things like Windy by Quincy Jones and songs like that, which was a very fast-paced song and drove people crazy that I was doing choreography for. The list goes on as it relates to dance. And I think of my first injuries with my ankles when I first went on tow and how my mother put me in ice skating to help shore up those, what we call double jointed ankles, which just meant that I had hyperextension in my knees and ankles, which made it more difficult when you're almost 5'10" to dance. And when I think about how me and my sisters were at Tony's School of Dance, and I still have a picture of the 3 of us. I was 15, Carla was 10, and Margot was 5. And we're in this picture of the 3 of us in a pose together. And then I remember at the University of Minnesota becoming the student art director for the whole campus. We had all kinds of programs. And performing arts was just one, and dance was one of those. And I didn't realize then, but looking back on it, I was responsible for programming for 40,000 students. In our auditoriums, we had people like Chicago, Average White Band. And then we had a coffee house where, I didn't mention Al Jarreau and some others, but we had a coffee house where we auditioned this kid. He was like 14. And he had this like weird stuff on his eyes, and he had this guitar, and he was like so tiny. I think he became Prince many years later. Remember, I was in Minnesota, and my colleagues who were the adults in the room, the director of arts on campus, I was the student director, didn't want anything to do with this kid because our coffee house was bluegrass music. And I said, no, look at what he's doing with that guitar. We just need to have him here. So I had so many experiences, but in dance, I was able on campus not only to be a soloist in the dance company, and we traveled all over, but I was able to get discriminated against when we traveled through the Midwest, where they wouldn't let me stay in the dorm at the University of Nebraska, where in Iowa, they wouldn't serve me ice cream, and me and 3 of my other dance friends, because of course I'm the only Black person in the dance company, walked out. And there was a lot of isolation publicly, but camaraderie privately among our dance troupe for the university. I also started a young children's dance company when I was in college for underprivileged children in the community of St. Paul, Minnesota. And we performed at places like the Walker Art Center, the Guthrie, which were the premier houses, if you will, in Minneapolis at the time. And I love these kids. And the numbers of them grew once I started the program there. And I don't know how I had time because I had like 2 or 3 jobs. I was doing 2 degrees at once. And I was dancing in the dance company. And I was playing a little bit of violin in a Baroque group on the side. How do we do all that stuff, Christine? Yeah, it's insane. But I loved my children's dance troupe, and I got to choreograph some things. And a couple of my friends have gone on to be household names in film and in Hollywood that I did choreography for when we were all just kids in Minnesota, of all places. And then I told you about my dance in Europe. There is an article of me that my mom put together in a scrapbook. She did scrapbooks for all 3 of us while she was ill with pancreatic cancer. She went very quickly. And I cherish that scrapbook today. But one of the things in there is an article about me teaching Keep Fit in Altrincham, which is a suburb of Manchester, England, and how I went from 10 people to 60 people dancing to keep fit. I think we would call that Zumba today. That's the word, right? And then fast forward after that, there were dance companies when I lived in California. I didn't tell you, I lived in New York, California, Chicago. We raised our kids in DC. I grew up in Detroit. I spent time in Minnesota. When I was in California, I lived in San Diego almost 10 years. I was with part of a dance company there, and we toured places like Vegas, Tahoe, things like that, while I was working for IBM. So I could only join the troupe on the weekends and things like that. But all those opportunities I had to give up corporate life, and I held on instead of giving it up when I was dancing, and multiple accolades that I just kind of ignored and tucked in a box. So the last dance thing I'll say, because there's so much more I could talk about, how Twyla Thorpe kind of tore my body apart the first time I met her. And if you don't know who she is, she's a contemporary dance goddess, I would say, one of those of our time. She's had the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She's won Tony Awards. She's done all kinds of things with her work. But I met her in a masterclass in campus at the University of Minnesota. And we were doing some movement, She comes and just knocks me down on the floor, literally just pushes me down. And I look up at her. I didn't even know who she was. So I didn't know it was her, Twyla. And I'm like, this B, what the blank? Because remember, I'm an inner city kid from Detroit. I don't play that crap. You don't touch me. You don't. And what is this crazy dance movement anyway? Because I didn't know modern or contemporary dance at that time. I had grown up very stylized with jazz and ballet and tap. And she basically knocked me down and came over to me and said, there's so much more inside of you. Stop being so rigid. Let it all go. Learn to fly. And I had no idea what she was talking about. But at the end of the week, I was flying all around the room, getting thrown all over the place, leaping and jumping, twirling back down on the floor and using my gymnastics capability along with my discipline from ballet and things. And it was a whole nother level of dance for me. And I loved it. 42. I taught in DC at a couple different places as my kids were growing up. My son was born when I was 40, my daughter when I was 37. I was teaching at the Liz Lehrman Dance Exchange when I did my last performance, and they got to see it. And my son claims he remembers it to this day, but I don't know. The culmination of all of my love of dance was last year in October. I was inspired by the fact that Alvin Ailey was coming to Paris for the first time in over 8 years. I decided to celebrate my 70th there with family and friends. I was blessed with over 40 people turning up from different countries to celebrate for a week with me. But it started with me saying, if Alvin Ailey's going to be there, I'm going to be there. We had about 28, 30 of us attended the concert. They gave me a poster signed by all the dancers. And it was like to an OG dance diva from your babies. So that is a way to appreciate and honor dance forever for me.
I asked Ava to describe what was going on in her life that inspired her and her husband to purchase property in Spain and then move to Spain.
So, coming to Spain, how did it all happen? I am in Annapolis, Maryland with my husband in 2016. He is retired just recently. He and I talk about getting a vacation property. Maybe it could end up being a retirement property. My husband is more well-traveled than I am in his life. He starts looking at places in other countries. He joins a group, kind of an online presence, newsletters and things called Live and Invest Overseas. He narrows his search and ends up with Panama, Portugal as two places to look at. We decide to take a vacation. 2 weeks before the vacation, an article in the Wall Street Journal has a 2-page spread with pictures about this little place in Spain called Valencia. And he goes, well, we're going to Mallorca for vacation after we finish Portugal. Why don't we just add on and see this place in Valencia? Because the article was pretty compelling about all the great things about this city, which is the third largest city in Spain, on the Mediterranean, etc. Okay, so we go to Portugal. Remember I told you I have 2 knee replacements? Well, Lisbon was gorgeous, but my knees did not like it at all. And Portuguese is an interesting language. Seems a bit difficult for people like me. Language challenged. We go to Mallorca, La Palma. We hang out. We go to Valencia. We live at an Airbnb for our time there, which was just 3 nights, I believe. And that Airbnb happens to be in the old city of Valencia, right where the cathedral that was built in the early 1400s is located. So we get there late at night. The next morning, we open the shutters to bells ringing and we go, ah, my God, look at this plaza. Look at this beauty. It was love at first sight. Fast forward, we go back for another week, a few months later. Then we go back like a month after that. We look at 24 properties, we buy one. Meanwhile, I'm still working at that time. I had just started as a CEO of a software development company, and Steve was in early retirement. We buy this property. We say, okay, we'll visit it. We can rent it out. It has a tourist license. It's right in the town center and gives us time to explore Spain while we're there when we visit. Then there was this thing called COVID that happened. It's interesting because during COVID, it was probably the first time my husband and I had been together nonstop since we've known each other. We both traveled extensively in our careers. Me at PricewaterhouseCoopers, at IBM, at Booz Allen Hamilton, and my own consulting business, him with all of his political appointments and work that he did as a lawyer, etc., global leader of this, that, and the other. So when we were together during COVID, like so many, we experienced so much stress and strife around the loss of relatives and friends before the vaccine. I was trying to run a company remotely. It was really stressful. And we tended, as a lawyer and a consultant by background, to do whiteboarding sessions to plan our family life. So we were whiteboarding, what are we going to do now based on COVID, based on what you're doing, what I'm not doing, meaning my husband being retired. And the first question my husband asked me was, if I wasn't here, where would you be? And I said, oh, Valencia, probably, or London, where our daughter lives. And I asked him the same question, and he pretty much came to the same conclusion. And so he looked at me, I looked at him, and he says, well, then why are we here? And that was kind of a profound question that we didn't have a good answer for beyond doing the typical, right? Working hard, taking care of people, being good community citizens, all of that. So we came up with a 2.5-year plan to move overseas, thinking we'd start in Spain and then explore other places when we had more time. And that maybe at the end of the 2.5 years, I would start thinking about retirement. Well, that was the beginning of October 2020. A friend came by and said a couple weeks later, you guys have a great place. We could sell this place. And next thing I know, from October to December 2020, we moved to Spain. It was during COVID. Someone sold our house in one day, actually the night that they listed it, fully furnished, in Annapolis, Maryland, which was a beautiful home right there close to the water. And we found ourselves getting a 90-day temporary visa that we had started 4 months prior, in 4 days before our flight that we had scheduled to go to Valencia. It arrived because we had decided, well, we're going to go check on our property. And it took literally 4 months because of COVID. We got there December 20th, mask inside, mask outside, which we liked because we had lost people. And so we were big on keeping masks on, and we're older. So fast forward from there, my husband comes out of retirement. I go into retirement. He takes a role with a company that he travels globally. And we go back and forth to the US and other places until this past summer, 2024, when we decided to get rid of our last place in DC where we raised our kids. And we're here permanently. And it has been a lifesaver. So many ways for me and for him.
I asked Ava to share her personal definition of wellness and how has that practice or concept evolved as she has lived abroad.
My personal definition of wellness. I literally had abandoned my plan to get my physical, emotional, and spiritual health back on track after slaying dragons on so many career moves and having so much impact by agreeing after a brief retirement to take over as a CEO for a software development firm. And there I was trying to transform this company, finding new partners, new ways to engage, new exciting ways to deliver financial services software. And this thing called COVID happened. And all of a sudden I was managing, leading, trying to transform a business remotely, which was a whole nother paradigm. At the same time, me as a person went to the back burner. My whole psyche was just not anywhere near anything to handle, manage wellness for myself. I was doing so much damage to myself, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And I didn't even know it. I was just caught in this morass of trying to help everything else survive and everyone else survive. My husband literally dragged me to Spain because he was retired at the time. I got here and the tranquil, peaceful nature of this culture just enveloped all of my being to the point where even though I cocooned for a bit, I retired not long after we got here in 2020. We were still working remotely with my company, but there was this awakening that I wasn't going to be here if I didn't make some drastic changes. And Spain gave me the ability to create a whole new lens and new lenses and ways to look at life because it was quiet. It was calm. There was no violence. There was no pressure to perform and make everything perfect in spite of all the barriers that you face as a Black woman, especially as a CEO in the US. It was all gone all of a sudden. And the quiet and the peace just took over. And I woke up realizing that I was a wreck. But there was all this great produce at this place called the Central Market that tastes like something real. That was like what I got from my friend's garden in the US, not from what I got from the Safeway or the Harris Teeter or even Trader Joe's or Whole Foods. Come on. This stuff here was real produce. And the laws in Europe make it so that you get things that are really so much fresher and so much less contaminated. I began to embrace the goodness of the produce, the great cultural calmness of the Toria, the park that wraps around the whole city. It's like 5 central parks in one, if you will. And I remember my husband and I laying in the grass and falling asleep and waking up and saying, oh my God, we weren't robbed. We weren't attacked. What a life is this? I remember early days going to restaurants and my husband didn't have to make sure his back was to the door and his head wasn't on a swivel. And I remember walking down the streets and people might stare at us because we were a little different, but it wasn't because we were Black in America. I never got stopped by police just for being out like I often did at home. So the stress alone of not being Black in America took a weight off of me that allowed me then to focus on my health physically. And I said, okay, I'm not going out like this. And so I got a second knee replacement in Spain. Best healthcare system, I think. It's been ranked number 4 and number 9 in the world. And the U.S. is 29 and 49, depending on what you look at, between Forbes, Bloomberg, and others. Oh my God. Here I am a year later after my knee replacement right now. And I am going to just get real and tell you the truth. When I came here in U.S. pounds, I weighed 284. I now weigh 184. I'm hoping to get to 170, which is my goal. But can you imagine what it has done for me physically, taking all of that weight off of my joints? And can you imagine how moribund I was mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to let all of that take over my life when it hadn't been a part of my life in recent years? Oh my goodness. The warrior goddess is back, baby. And it's all due to being in Valencia.
I asked Ava if there was anything that I should have asked her during our conversation. And this is what she shared.
There is so much in a life that is long-lived that can be shared. And I feel like this podcast is giving me a chance to have a glimpse of myself in ways that I don't focus on a daily basis. So if I could share 2 things. In my life, I've had the opportunity, based on my husband's career, to see behind the scenes at the highest levels of the political environment in the U.S. and some overseas. Because of my second father, I've had the opportunity to experience the most renowned household names in the music industry, to be friends with them, to understand them, to have them nurture me. Because of my experience with the first guy I fell in love with in college as a freshman, I've been at the highest heights of professional athleticism in our country and in others. Because of my blind tenacity, I've had the opportunity to be in C-suites across the world, talking about technology, implementing tech in ways that I never could have imagined. And when I add all of this up, the most important thing in life is health, love of self, love from friends and family. You can have all the material wealth that can be bequeathed, obtained, stolen, whatever. If you don't have physical health, I think Steve Jobs is a good example of what happens when your physical health fails. And you have not had love in your life from friends or family, it's a difficult way to go. So as we proceed as Black women from America living in other countries, we have to remove the burdens that we so religiously took on, have taken on, continue to take on in our home country of the U.S. to be above, better, faster, quicker, smarter, younger, beautiful, sexier, whatever the blank we have decided we have to own, and let go of it all and find out who we are to ourselves and let that be what the world experiences. And in that, we'll be forever just elevated in a sense of wellness that is indescribable, quite honestly. Don't give in to the fear. Don't give in to what everyone else thinks you should have, be, want, do, see. Find for yourself your own path. There's so many out there. Travel them, baby. Get on it.
Ava, thank you so much for your generosity, your infectious spirit, and just your candor. I really love chatting with you, and thank you so much for sharing your incredible story with the Flourish in the Foreign audience. If you all want to keep up with Ava, you can online.
So T Hilton 31 on Instagram is a good messaging place for me. T Hilton 31 on Instagram. I'll be honest, I don't post much of anything, but I do promote my sister who's an actor and my daughter who's in music and others when they post. But I also answer messages when I get them.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Flourish in the Foreign. To learn more information about this guest, be sure to check out their show notes page on the website flourishintheforeign.com. If you'd like me to come speak to your group, your organization, your sorority, your company, or any other type of entity, I can. Yes, did you know that? I can. I am available for paid speaking engagements, which includes in-person talks as well as remote talks. Yes, I do travel. I really do. If you're interested in booking me for an in-person or remote paid speaking engagement, you can find my media kit, my speaker page, and all booking information on the website flourishintheforeign.com, also on my personal website, christinejob.com, and in the description of this here episode. If you'd like to delve deep into my personal thoughts about life abroad, be sure to subscribe to my Substack, Flourish in the Foreign, Truths and Musings. If you enjoy this solo indie Black woman podcast, be sure to support this podcast by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/flourishforeign. You can also support the podcast by subscribing to the podcast, leaving a review of the podcast, and of course, sharing the podcast. For resources like the Move Abroad with Intention guide and course, be sure to check the links in the description of this episode and the website flourishintheforeign.com. To learn more about me, Christine Job, my work as a business strategist, and all my resources about business strategy, building a business, and more, check out the links in the description of this episode and go to christinejob.com. Big thanks to all of you, my lovely listeners who have kept this podcast going strong for 6 seasons. Thank you all so much. I love you and I appreciate you. And thanks to Zachary Higgs for producing the music for this here podcast. Remember, it is not about moving abroad. It's not about being abroad. It's about thriving abroad. It's about flourishing abroad. So go abroad and cultivate a life well lived. See you next time. Bye. In the next episode of Flourish in the Foreign.
And just a final reminder, if you're still wanting to contribute to your U.S. retirement account from abroad, remember you have to have U.S. earned income. So a lot of people forget. I hope this helps someone.